The Ki-43 doesn't announce itself with firepower. It just shows up somewhere it shouldn't be. Over Malaya, Brewster Buffaloes hold a loose orbit over a coastal strip, pilots watching the beaches below. Then the radio barks a warning. Slim fighters drop out of the glare. The Buffaloes break to defend. One rolls hard, tightening the circle, waiting for the attacker to overshoot. It doesn't. The Hayabusa snaps its flaps down and keeps rotating, the nose still biting as the airspeed bleeds away. The Buffalo's turn opens. The Japanese fighter is already inside the circle, compact and steady, lining up a shot the Buffalo pilot didn't think was possible at this speed. For a moment, it looks effortless. The truth is, it's a trick, but one that comes with a steep price for the Ki-43. In 1938, Japan's aviation industry was surging. Factories ran at full speed to expand output rapidly by local standards. They were pushing the nation from importer to mass producer in a single generation. Shipyards and steel plants fed the boom, while new engine works turned out power plants strong enough to compete in the Pacific and Asian theaters. Even as resources, reliability, and high-altitude performance still lagged behind Western rivals. The buildup was deliberate, with modern fighters rolling off the lines in anticipation of an air war the leadership foresaw. The problem was that this surge was happening inside a force split down the middle. Instead of entering World War II as a single force, the country went in with two services that guarded their independence like territory. The Army and Navy had spent years fighting over budgets, influence, and strategy, so rivalry came naturally, while cooperation didn't. Each branch ran its own air arm with separate plans and requirements. That split flowed into industry, with Nakajima building fighters for the Army and Mitsubishi for the Navy. The two sides rarely shared tooling, parts, or production lines, even when it would have saved time and material. The divide reached logistics too. Ammunition, spares, and even maintenance items were often service-specific, creating two parallel supply systems when one would have sufficed. So while the United States was building aircraft in enormous numbers through a single industrial system, Japan wasted materials and skilled labor it couldn't replace, slowed upgrades, and kept valuable planes on the ground, waiting for the right parts. Even with that handicap, the Army Air Force was confident about how air battles should be fought. The late 1930s had already taught it a decisive lesson during the first major air campaign it fought at scale. A nighttime clash between Japanese and Chinese troops near Beijing, triggered by a disputed training exercise, flared in July 1937. It became known as the Marco Polo Bridge Incident, and it pushed the conflict in China into full-scale war. What began with the Manchurian takeover had now become a grinding campaign across China's rivers, cities, and plains, fought on the ground and in the air. In the sky, the imbalance was immediate. The Chinese Air Force flew bravely, but with a patchwork mix of interwar biplanes, early monoplanes, and small-batch foreign imports, many of which were already outdated. Japan, by contrast, arrived with organized air units, stronger supply lines, and a doctrine focused on taking control of the air. At the point of that spear was the Nakajima Ki-27. By European standards, the Ki-27 already looked behind the times with its fixed landing gear, a light airframe, a modest engine, and two rifle-caliber machine guns. Western fighters were moving toward heavier guns, retractable gear, and higher speeds. Yet in East Asia, its agility dominated. Over North China, the Army's fighters went straight in incoming formations, then peeled off into steep climbing turns after a quick burst. Pursuers tried to follow and couldn't hold the angle. Chinese biplanes lost speed, eventually stalling or scattering. Older monoplanes shoved their noses down to escape, only to find a Japanese fighter already curling inside their turn before they could level out. With its light wing loading, Japanese fighters could bank and pivot with almost no effort, letting trained pilots stay just outside an enemy's guns while they reset for another pass. Every engagement reinforced the same impression that this little Army fighter could dominate the kind of close-range combat Japan preferred. Doctrine hardened around the idea that air battles would be settled in tight, low-speed turning engagements, where skill and maneuverability mattered most. Armor, heavier guns, and protected fuel tanks were viewed as unnecessary weight. In the Army's eyes, the ideal fighter was meant to turn inside the enemy, stay on his tail, and avoid being hit in the first place. Even so, as 1938 rolled around, the Army could see that the Ki-27 was nearing the end of its usefulness. Air combat abroad was moving toward retractable gear, heavier armament, and higher speeds. Khalkhin Gol in 1939 made the danger hard to ignore. Japanese units ran into Soviet Polikarpovs that were quicker, better armed, and increasingly reliant on steep dives and hit-and-run attacks rather than turning duels. Japanese pilots still scored plenty of victories through skill and the Ki-27's handling, but the battle showed a new rule taking shape. If an opponent refused to turn with you, speed and firepower could decide the fight. With Western rearmament accelerating, the Army needed a replacement fast. However, it first had to settle who would build it. In the last fighter competition, Nakajima's Ki-27 had won, leaving Mitsubishi and Kawasaki to swallow expensive prototype losses. Both firms pressed Tokyo for a new procurement system that would end open contests and limit financial risk. The government agreed. Instead of multiple companies building rivals, the Army would pick one manufacturer for the next fighter project and back it through development. That decision pushed the contract straight back to Nakajima. The new project was labeled Ki-43, and a specification sheet that pushed beyond realistic performance limits. They wanted 500 kilometers per hour on the top end, 1,000 meter per minute climb, and an 800 kilometer range. On top of that, maneuverability was to at least equal the Ki-27's. The brief pulled in opposite directions. Speed, range, and climb demanded more engine, fuel, and structure, all of which added weight and dulled turns. Still, Nakajima couldn't refuse without losing the Army. Hideo Itakawa, Nakajima's chief designer and engineer, took this impossible brief, and with barely a year to get a prototype into the air, started to bargain with reality. By early January 1939, the first prototype was ready. It was a clean, low-wing monoplane with a closed cockpit, retractable gear, and the new HA-25 radial up front, exactly the kind of modern successor the Army said it wanted. In the air, though, it disappointed almost at once. To meet the maneuverability requirement, Nakajima's engineers took the most direct route: increase wing area. If the new fighter was heavier than the Ki-27, the wing had to grow with it by roughly 50%. The extra lift helped in the turn, but it came with a penalty. Drag surged. That drag blunted everything else. The prototype was slow to accelerate and struggled to reach the top speed the Army expected. Instead of a crisp frontline dogfighter, it felt like it was sliding toward an escort role. Nakajima tried again with a smaller compromise wing, about 20% larger than the Ki-27's. To keep performance up, they chased weight out of the airframe wherever they could. Structural members were slimmed down. Internal fittings were stripped back and reorganized. The skin was pulled tight over a very light frame. This version recovered much of the lost speed, but the test pilots still weren't convinced. Compared to the Ki-27, the Ki-43 felt heavier on the controls and slower to respond. They also disliked features that didn't serve the turning fight. The closed canopy was criticized because many pilots preferred the open-air visibility they were used to. Retractable landing gear, meanwhile, was seen as adding weight and complication without any payoff in a low-speed duel. Those reactions could have ended the program. Instead, Nakajima staked its own funds on 10 more pre-production aircraft and went back to the drawing board. The canopy was reshaped to improve sightlines. The fuselage was lengthened and refined to sharpen handling. Cockpit layout and radio installation were cleaned up to make the aircraft more practical in service. Then they found the modification that transformed the aircraft. Nakajima fitted Fowler-type butterfly combat flaps under the center wing. Dropped in a fight, they let pilots pull the nose around harder, without running into the usual drag wall. The effect was immediate. Turning performance tightened sharply, and the Ki-43 could loop and pivot at very low speeds while staying controllable. Test pilots came back impressed. For the first time, the Army could see the agile successor it had demanded. Yet that gain had a price. To keep the airframe as light as possible, the wings were built close to those structural limits. In ordinary turns, the fighter felt solid. In steep dives and high G pullouts, it was operating with less margin than anyone wanted to admit. The Army approved the type in 1941. The Ki-43 entered service as the Army Type 1 fighter and received its name, Hayabusa, Peregrine Falcon. Its first combat sorties were flown over China in October as the 59th and 64th Sentai began converting to the new fighter, while much of the world still underestimated Japanese air power. Early on, Ki-43s mostly flew patrols and escorts until veterans trained on the Ki-27 discovered what the Hayabusa's combat flaps let them do in a fight. A patrol might spot enemy aircraft slipping along the top of a broken cloud layer, climb above them, then drop in with the sun behind. The first pass stayed fast and straightforward with a short burst, tracers cutting across the target, then a sharp pull-up to reset. When the fight tightened, the flaps went down, and the Ki-43 showed its edge. It could swing the nose through a turn at speeds other fighters couldn't hold without stalling, looping, and pivoting at around 270 kilometers per hour, right on the margin of control. Then it would roll back into the fight, already inside the other pilot's circle. China, though, was only the opening act. The real test arrived in December 1941, when the Army's fighter arm went south into Malaya and the Dutch East Indies under a wave of air attacks meant to crack Allied defenses fast. Over Malaya, the Hayabusa finally met modern opposition in numbers, and for a moment, it looked like the perfect answer. The main Allied fighter there was the Brewster Buffalo, a sturdy but heavy aircraft dulled by tropical heat and flown by squadrons already running short on spares and sleep. Buffaloes tried to hold formation over beaches and airfields under attack, only to see Ki-43s peel down through them like hawks. Japanese pilots climbed above the invasion routes, dropped in pairs out of the sun, sliced through with a short burst, and refused to linger. They pulled into tight climbing turns the Buffalo couldn't follow, arced upward until they were almost hanging on the prop, then rolled over and fell back into the fight inside the Buffalo's circle. A Buffalo pilot would bank defensively and feel the Hayabusa tightening around him until the Japanese nose was there again, close enough to fill the canopy. Allied pilots who survived those first days were rattled. Many had expected slow, fragile Japanese aircraft. Instead, they met an agile monoplane that turned like nothing else in the air. Sergeant Gregory Richmond captured the shock after diving on what he assumed was a zero and being ambushed. Quote, "Before I could set up the fighter, all hell broke loose behind me. The instrument panel exploded and blew apart. Brilliant fire gushed from the fuel tanks. No one knew what the Zeros were, but they were not slow, ancient, fabric-covered biplanes. When hurricanes arrived, the match stiffened, but many Allied pilots still tried to meet the Ki-43 in turning fights, and the Hayabusa punished them. Malaya crowned the Ki-43 as a dominant early war fighter, even with its fragility and light firepower, which later battles would expose. By early 1942, Allied pilots had settled on a code name for the Ki-43, Oscar. The fighter was appearing in enough fights and doing enough damage that crews needed a short label that could snap out over the radio without confusion. However, the fighter's dominance in a turning fight came from thin margins. Pilots found that out first in training, when instructors drove new Ki-43 flights through the same high-G routines they'd used on Ki-27s. A Hayabusa would respond beautifully right up to its limit, and sometimes that limit gave way. Nakajima reduced the wing structure to the minimum acceptable strength, which left the aircraft vulnerable during high-stress maneuvers. There were accidents in which a pilot went into a steep dive or yanked through a tight pullout and felt the aircraft fail structurally, the wings separating before anyone could issue a warning. Even when the airframe remained intact, it offered limited protection during combat. Early Hayabusas carried almost no pilot protection and lacked self-sealing fuel tanks. Rifle-caliber hits could punch straight into the cockpit or tanks, and a short burst from 50-caliber guns often set the aircraft alight immediately. Its light armament forced pilots to resort to risky tactics. The Ki-43-1 carried 2 column-mounted machine guns, synchronized to fire through the propeller arc, and many early aircraft used twin 77mm Type 89s. That setup made victories harder than they needed to be. Oscar pilots had to get in close, sit on a target's tail, and hold their bursts longer to do real damage. In an aircraft with little armor and a fragile airframe, every extra second in the firing lane increased the chance of being hit. Japan's Army-Navy split didn't help things either. The result was squadrons grounded for want of the right spares, delayed upgrades, and fragile Hayabusas kept in the air by cannibalizing other Hayabusas. Nakajima could see where the Ki-43-1 was headed. If the Army wanted the Hayabusa to survive the next phase of the war, it had to be strengthened while it was still fighting. Even before the early model's first surge was over, frontline reports were piling up, talking about cracked structures, fire losses, and performance limits that would only get harsher as Allied fighters got faster and carried more guns. The answer was the Ki-43-2, a reinforced Hayabusa instead of a clean-sheet replacement, rebuilt around the problems the front kept flagging. There was no luxury to start over. With time and industry already stretched thin, Nakajima held back several Ki-43-1s as testbeds and began reworking the design in steps, starting with the one upgrade that touched everything else: power. The HA-115, with a 2-speed supercharger, produced a little over 1,150 horsepower and turned a 3-blade propeller. It still didn't make the Hayabusa a true high-speed interceptor, but it gave pilots better climb and quicker acceleration. It also meant more margin when fights went vertical and the earlier engine ran out of breath. That extra output would have been pointless if the airframe couldn't take it, so the wing came next. The structure was strengthened, and the span was trimmed by roughly 30 centimeters to address early failure scares. The revised wing could handle higher G-loads without the same risk of cracking. It was also approved to carry drop tanks or small bomb racks, giving units more flexibility without turning every hard pull into a structural gamble. Survivability was still the Hayabusa's weak point, but the Ki-43-2 finally tried to improve it. Seat and back armor were added, along with rubber-coated fuel tanks intended to reduce fire risk. It was still short of Allied standards, but damage that once meant an immediate torch now had a better chance of ending as a limping return. Firepower improved too, though within the limits of the design. Armament standardized on two 12.7mm HO-103 machine guns in the nose. It was an improvement, but a limited one. They were effective against light aircraft, but struggled to penetrate armor and other tough structures, which meant the Hayabusa could punish the vulnerable and still come up short against the best protected targets. To make those shots count, the old telescopic tube sight was replaced with a reflector sight, which was faster to use, easier to track with, and far more practical for snapshots in a turning fight. Ki-43-2s began leaving the factory in February 1942, but the front didn't feel the shift immediately. Testing, approval, and the transition to production slowed delivery, and units didn't receive them in strength until late 1942. By then, the Ki-43-2 had given the Hayabusas a second wind, making it tougher, less prone to burning, and more capable across a wider set of missions. It just arrived in a sky that was filled with faster, heavier Allied fighters in numbers the Army couldn't match. As such, when 1942 rolled in, the Hayabusa's advantage was no longer a surprise. The samurai plane started losing the war it was built for. Allied pilots learned not to follow the Ki-43 into a turning fight. Instead, they used the simplest escape that the Oscar hated most, a steep dive. The Ki-43 could not match the higher dive limits of its opponents. When a P-40 or Hurricane unloaded into a steep, fast drop, the Ki-43 pilot had a bad choice: follow and risk tearing the wings, or pull out and watch the target slide away. Claire Chenault turned that reality into doctrine for the American volunteer group. As one period account summed up his warning, his pilots were told to, quote, "close your range, fire, and dive away." From then on, Japanese pilots would haul into perfect turns and find only empty sky. The Flying Tigers kept the fight vertical, attacking and slashing passes and refusing to stay in circle. Late 1942 widened the gap. Allied forces recovered damaged Ki-43s on captured fields, and finally stripped them down on the intelligence bench. They confirmed that the Oscar was light, fragile, and undergunned. Protection was thin to non-existent, leaving pilots with no margin for error. Throughout 1943 and 44, new Allied fighters appeared in strength, including P-38 Lightnings, P-47s, improved Spitfires, and eventually P-51s. These were faster machines with heavier guns and the power to choose when to fight. A clash with a P-38 showed the new reality. An Oscar pilot hauled into a tight climbing turn, flaps down, trying to drag the twin-boom fighter into his world. The Lightning didn't follow. It dove steeply, built speed, and climbed back above the Ki-43 with altitude and momentum to spare. In a single high-speed pass, the Lightning's heavy guns inflicted severe damage on the Ki-43's lightly built airframe. That became the mid-war rhythm. Allied pilots used their speed advantage to control the engagement from beginning to end. If they wanted the engagement, they dove in hard. If they didn't, they left. The doctrine behind the Ki-43 was starting to fail in real time. Early in the war, The Ki-43's danger came less from the airframe than from the men inside it. The first Hayabusa pilots were seasoned veterans from China and the opening campaigns in Southeast Asia. They already knew how to fight on the edge, sense when an opponent was about to break, and use that moment like a trap closing. That early edge produced aces, like Sergeant Satoshi Anabuki, often cited as the Ki-43's top ace, credited with about 39 victories. His record is evidence of what the fighter could deliver when it was flown with discipline and clear judgment. Even Allied pilots who fought on energy, including the Flying Tigers, learned that an experienced Oscar pilot on your tail was hard to dislodge once he had the angle. The problem was that the war kept moving. From 1943 into 1944, Japan's experienced pilots were worn down across every front, and losses came faster than replacements could be trained. At the same time, fuel shortages and shrinking training programs meant new pilots arrived with fewer hours and less preparation for high-speed combat. For these rookies, the Ki-43's strengths often became liabilities. Army training still emphasized the turning duel, so when faster Allied fighters made slashing passes, inexperienced pilots often tried to force turning engagements rather than manage altitude and energy. The opponent usually refused. He would dive out, climb back with room to spare, and return from a better angle. The new Ki-43 pilot was left low and slow, still turning for a fight that wasn't coming, until the next pass arrived. Around the same time, the job itself changed. As Allied air power grew, the Army began increasingly using Ki-43 units as interceptors. They were ordered up against bomber raids head-on. Withdrawn from Burma and thrown into the Army's ill-fated push toward India, the 64th Sentai found itself on bomber interception duty. During that campaign, one of its pilots, Shotaro Konishi, ran into a target no Army fighter had faced before, a B-29 Superfortress. It was the first recorded clash between the new American heavy bomber and the Ki-43. Konishi still went in. The B-29 was enormous in his windscreen, flying high and steady, with multiple gun turrets already tracking him. Tracer fire reached out in long arcs as he closed. He managed to get within range and fired the two nose-mounted machine guns, but the Hayabusa's light armament barely had a chance against a 4-engine bomber built to take punishment. He couldn't bring it down. Just getting out of the bomber's defensive fire alive was its own kind of success. Late in the war, there were attempts to squeeze more out of the airframe. The Ki-43-3 program aimed to add a stronger engine and Tachikawa-tested cannon arm variants. Still, the design could carry only a limited amount of ammunition, and by then, the Army was short of veteran pilots who could make those few rounds count. As such, by 1944, the Hayabusa was no longer shaping the air war. It was being used wherever there was still an airfield, a little fuel, and a pilot to send up. A fighter designed for tight duels was now kept in reserve for whatever emergency broke next. Many airframes were flying far past their intended service life. Ground crews kept them going with field patches and cannibalized parts, and every takeoff asked more of a machine already worn thin. Across the war, roughly 5,900 Hayabusas were built. That made it the Army's most common fighter, even as newer types arrived too slowly and in too few numbers to matter. Yohei Hinoki, who flew the Hayabusa from its rise into its decline, put it plainly, quote, "When it had become a good attack plane, things were changing. It was now to be used for defense as an interceptor. So again, its firepower was insufficient, and it lacked the speed needed for attacking bombers. The Oscar was coming to the end of its time." Then came the aircraft's final evolution. As raids over the home islands grew heavier and the threat of invasion hung over every briefing, Ki-43 units were divided between two desperate jobs. Some stayed on air defense, climbing in small flights through contrails and flak just to get a short firing chance before breaking away from escorts they couldn't outrun. Many more were reassigned to special attack units, simply because there were still Ki-43 units available. On rough strips, young pilots climbed into worn Oscars with explosives bolted to the fuselage. Ground crews ran the controls, cinched harnesses, and sent them off on orders that assumed they would not return. During these missions, a pilot would taxi out and feel how light the airplane still was, even as it was being used like a guided weapon. The same combat flaps that once helped veterans snap through tight spirals were still under the wings, and the pilot worked throttle and trim out of habit, almost as if he was going into a fight he could come back from. He lifted off low, turned along the shoreline, and stayed under the clouds, where visibility broke up and the horizon stayed busy. Down close to the water, the Hayabusa still had one edge. It could change direction fast in the air, which made heavier fighters reluctant to follow. Then the fleet came into view through haze and smoke, and the sky contracted around him. Flak bursts punched at his approach, and tracers reached up in steady, stitched lines. He flew an uneven path, using small, sharp corrections to spoil the gunner's aim, keeping the nose moving just enough to slip through gaps. For a few seconds, the Ki-43 felt like itself again. This time, there was no reset. The approach had to be straightened. The ship swelled in the windscreen until it blocked out the sea, and the controls stopped being about survival and became about lining up. No climbing turn, no reset, no second pass. Just the Hayabusa's narrow nose locked forward, committed to a single line all the way in. When the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan in August 1945, it pushed beyond Manchuria. Under the Yalta terms, Soviet forces pushed north and east, toward the outposts that controlled the sea lanes between the Sea of Okhotsk and the Pacific. And once the first Soviet landings began in the Kurils, the air war arrived with them. Aircraft started crossing the islands in support of assault troops, hunting airstrips, hammering positions, and trying to choke off Japanese shipping before any surrender could lock the map in place. On the Japanese side, there was no depth left to absorb that kind of pressure. The island garrisons had been short of fuel, spares, and replacements for months. The air cover that remained was thin and worn, as Ki-43s operated from rough strips, kept alive with whatever parts could still be shipped north. So when Soviet fighters appeared around the Shrimshu landings on and after August 18th, the response came fast, but far from clean. There were no planned sweeps, nor mass formations, just small flights pushed into the air as quickly as engines could be coaxed to life, climbing into a sky already streaked with contrails and cut by distant bursts of fire. What followed was a series of scattered and unorganized clashes. Ki-43 pilots tried to fight the way they'd been trained to, turning hard, bleeding speed on purpose, searching for the moment to slice across a Soviet fighter's line of sight and take a quick shot before the enemy could pull away. But Soviet pilots rarely gave them that moment. They treated speed like protection, cutting through in a passing attack, firing as they crossed, and climbing away immediately to reset outside the Hayabusa's reach. They were in, let out a tight burst of shots, and were out again before the turn could close and hold them there. In those brief encounters, no clear victories were recorded. It was a tired aircraft meeting a new opponent at the end of a long war, exchanging fire in fragments without any realistic chance of changing what was already closing in. After a few more scattered engagements over the Kurils, the remaining Ki-43s came back down. They landed, refueled when they could, patched what they could, and waited for orders that never came. Days later, Japan surrendered, and the Hayabusa's war ended there, overtaken by events larger than any one unit or airplane.